Really? Yeah, go on. Okay. So, as well as all of us here, we're live streaming to the world. So that's why Rupert said, "Can I use the mic?" No. So, you know, actually, we may feel like just a very good turnout, but actually there's hundreds of people here in the ether somewhere. So my name is Peter McFadden. I'm a town councillor here in Frome. And over the last decade, I've played a role in getting environmental issues sort of higher up the agenda. Initially through founding something called Sustainable Frome, which is effectively a transition town movement in Frome, and then in my role in the town council. And I've got a short job this evening, which is to give you a little bit of background as to why we're here, or how we've reached this point, and then introduce some speakers, and then attempt to keep time and sort of facilitate the discussion that we want to have afterwards. Because this is very much about you, as opposed to just experts, although we have got some experts. So the second half, or the second part of this evening, will be very much, a workshop getting other people's ideas. And I really want to thank you, this number of people, and being here. It's awfully easy to get distracted by the adrenaline of things like politics or sort of daily concerns. And usually at meetings, there's a huge elephant in the room, which is climate change. And it's a real, pleasure in some ways, although not in many others, to be at a meeting where actually the elephant is and will be thoroughly exposed. So I'm kind of assuming that that's why you're here, really, because this is where, climate change should be on every agenda, and it usually isn't, but it certainly is tonight. So 5 years ago, when Independence of Frome took over the town council, the council had no environmental policy of any kind at all. And we commissioned a report to sort of underpin decisions on, particularly on energy and sustainability, because we wanted to know what was going on in Frome. So we commissioned that report, and then shortly afterwards we employed a resilience officer in the shape and form of Anna, who's here, who has a unique role at this level of government in Britain. I expect most of you know, or I'm sure all of you, or nearly all of you know, there are many layers of government which we have to put up with. All we need to do as a town council is to have allotments and have one meeting a year. So all the extra stuff that we're doing in Frome is all extra. And there aren't other councils who have focused in the way that we have on this kind of issues. So we employed Anna, and one of the things that she and I realised early on was that initial report really didn't give us the depth that we needed. And so we asked Mark Letcher, who's going to talk to us later this evening, to really up that considerably, so that we really knew what was going on in Frome and had some initial ideas as to what we might do. And about the same time, members of our good government went off to Paris and signed up to us as a country, managing to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees, a temperature rise of 1.5 degrees. They then came home and did many things which were completely the opposite. And so, in terms of what they were then actually started doing. And I think that emboldened Anna and I and some others to think, well, actually, is there any reason why we shouldn't work? Why shouldn't we do the government's job for them? They're clearly not going to do it for us. So if we actually say this is what Frome needs, or this is what a small town would need in order to reach that target, and we sort of give that to them, maybe they'll do it. It's a sort of bit of a hope, but also perhaps other towns will be able to gather together, so we get a critical mass of effectively people saying, you may have gone off on some other agenda, but this is the right one. So that's part of what underpins this evening as well. So that nearly takes me to where I want to be. So the other thing, so that's where we've kind of got to. We've had these the report that Mark did, and then now we're really at the point of going and saying to the council and to the whole of Frome in a way, how much further do we want to take this? And so, as I said earlier, tonight's a bit of a workshop, and we've got some questions which we want you to feed into as to how and if we take this further, which I'll come to in a moment. So, one of the things that I think we've learned from Brexit is that informed decision-making is preferable to uninformed decision-making. So, we've got 4 people who are going to talk to us this evening in different ways, and I'll introduce them in one fell swoop, and then they'll do their bits. It's slightly surprising in some ways to have the ex-president of the Maldives in Frome, so Mohammed Nasheed really put climate change on the map for people in many ways. I'm sure many of you will remember his very high-profile cabinet meeting under the water, and what he was saying was that this is now, and this is affecting us, and this is going to impact upon us in a way that really raised the bar in terms of actually that was the Copenhagen climate change talks where he and I were in the same room at one point. And so he's going to introduce this evening and just say a few words really to give us a bit of national context, because in a way what we're doing here is we're jumping all those middle layers of government. This is Frome, and then there's global. This is local and global in a laid out before you. And so that's why he's here to put that. And then from our little conversation before, he's got lots of other interesting things, which I hope we'll pick to say, which I think we'll pick up later. And then we've got Richard who's here to tell us a bit about what the science says, to give us an absolutely unequivocal, this is what is going on with climate science now. So Richard is director of the Cabot Institute, which is in Bristol, and is a world-leading researcher on the challenges arising from how we live on this planet. So it's more than just climate change, but that's essentially what it does, and Richard's saying more about that. Then Mark's going to say a bit about his report and what it means for the town, or what it would mean for the town for us to become zero carbon by 2046. We chose 2046 because that's only 30 years, and 30 years feels a bit like it's sort of not very far. 2050 sounds like something way off into the future, whereas 30 years feels sort of manageable in some ways. And also, Bristol have got a target of 2050 and we wanted to be there. So hence 2046. And then Anna's going to say a little bit about what we're doing already in Frome. Because I think one of the things that's really important is to give a kind of a context of hope. It's awfully easy for these sort of discussions to become hopeless. And actually, we are doing a lot of things. And again, going back to that local and global, I think what can one do, but what you can do in your own life. And so my hope is that what Anna says will sort of show some of the things that an active and vibrant community can do about these things. So all of those talks, if I bully them hard enough, will be fairly short, or very short really. They're to sort of give a context for a discussion which we'll have, and then we'll introduce some questions which we want you to work on. So, without more ado, Mohammed.
Thank you very much, and good evening. When we were in government in the Maldives, we wanted to become carbon neutral. We wanted to make the Maldives a carbon neutral country. This was not because we felt that we could save the world or because the Maldives was emitting so much carbon, but we felt that we could gain a moral high ground and tell others that if it is possible for us to do it here, why can't everyone else not do it? Then our government got toppled in a coup, as they happened in the Maldives. And now I have just suddenly seen a town who is trying to do exactly the same thing. We did a carbon audit in the Maldives, and then we did, I think, 270 little projects. When completed, that would make the Maldives carbon neutral in 2020. Then we costed these projects, and we found how it can be implemented. So I believe that this is very, very possible. We need to build, I'll just give a little idea on what I'm talking about. We need to build a biosphere, an ecosystem, instead of a housing estate. We need to see a house not just as a shelter, but as a production unit that would produce its own energy and also its own food, and its own other materials as well. So if you take a town like Frome, which is 20,000 people, when this town becomes this biosphere or the ecosystem, it must have a housing program, a water system, a sewage system, roads and so on, all connected and all driven by the production units which are houses. And I think that this can be simply done through a procurement order, what I would call a procurement order. The town council has a piece of land and it wants to find a builder or someone to use that land. So they must ask for a contractor to come and build this. So they will build a procurement order which would then produce these housing units and therefore that carbon neutral town. So I'm very glad to be here. I was a bit told not to take too much time. I'm very happy to be here because Frome has started working on this. And I like to work for you. I think there are people interested in building these ecosystems. We can attract investors. I know a number of people, Sir Richard Branson, Ratan Tata, all of these people have pledged they will make money out of it. Don't worry about it. They will make money out of it and they will make it financially viable. And I think these things have to be financially viable. So you have resources, which is your land and whatever resource that you have. The town's council can give that as a concession that will attract your investments. And I like you as a town to decide on becoming carbon neutral and then working out how your town can become carbon neutral. It will become the first biosphere, the first ecosystem that would drive its own energy, drive its own life. And you will be imagining yourself not just simply humans, but also as animals living in this biosphere. So your lives also will be connected to the biosphere. You will have the good life, you must. Because you will have your own vineyard, you will have your own discos and everything else in a town. But all of these little things must be connected and it would produce you the biosphere, the ecosystem that you want. So I would like the university, the Bath University or Bristol, to write this procurement order. And I would like your town to tender it. And I would like someone, Richard Branson or Ratan Tata or someone, to buy it and to produce it. And I think it's very simple and I think it's doable. I think that will save the world and that will save the Maldives as much as it will save yourself. And we hope to therefore then advertise this, advocate this, and have Frome as the first biosphere in the world, and therefore everyone else following that. Thank you. Sure.
That's fantastic, and it's very difficult to follow that. Anna and Peter have charged me with, in our Cabinet Institute at the University of Bristol, we're interested in all sorts of things. I'm not going to talk about that. I brought a single magazine, if anyone is curious. What I am going to talk about is just the science of climate change. Things that I suspect most of you are familiar with, but I think the idea was, let's just remind ourselves why we're doing this. So I'm going back into my role as a scientist, not as a director of the Institute. And I'm going to break that rule with my first slide, only a little bit, because I just wanted to make 3 broader reflections that are somewhat within the remit of what this. I think it's important to recognize that climate change is not our only environmental problem. It's not our only problem in many ways. And if we don't acknowledge that, We're not going to bring everybody along with us. If we don't recognize that other people are worried more about their jobs, worried more about putting food on the table, worried more about the NHS, worried more about security, they're not going to come on a journey with us. We need to recognize that people have a lot of problems. What I think we should do a little bit more time in explaining is that climate change, I would argue, is not so much a problem in and of itself, but it's an issue because it exacerbates every one of those problems. If we're going to have a lot more heat waves, how sustainable is our NHS? And I can make many, many, many other examples along those lines. So I think we need to look at this holistically as part of how we view our society. The second comment is very much a scientific comment. I am a geologist. I look at how things have changed in the past. And one thing that we know is that if you add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, it stays there for a long time. If we decrease our emissions, that will slow climate change. And that is no bad thing. But it will not stop climate change. We only stop climate change if we become carbon neutral, just as you were saying. And then the final point is really more in Marxian, but I just felt obliged to say it, which is that decarbonization is going to be hard. I honestly don't think that any household, any city, any town can really go it alone. We all have to go it together. But that doesn't mean that some organizations, some towns cannot lead and be examples. But also, if you're a leader, you will reap the rewards by being the innovators, being on the sharp end, not just of the new technology, but the new innovations, the new social structures. You will be the smart ones. And people will come to you for advice and wisdom. So let's just take a step back to the science then. Right. As I mentioned, I'm a geologist, so I always start with a few fundamental facts about climate change. There's things that we debate, there's things on which we're uncertain, and there are things that we know very, very, very well. So I'm just going to say a few things about what we know very, very well. Those are, I think, my first 3 points. And then a few things about what we don't know well, but we should still worry about. One thing we do know, climate changes. We have ice ages. You go back in time some 50 million years ago, there are palm trees and robust forests on Antarctica, around the Arctic Circle. Climate is not unchangeable. It will change. Now that little fact can be manipulated. Climate changes, so humans can't do anything. That is naive. That's like saying that what difference does it matter, if people get cancer or are murdered because people die? It happens. Not a terribly sophisticated way of looking at it. Climate changes. We know why. It changes because of how the sun acts. It changes because of where the continents are, and it changes because of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There's a few other things that come in, play a role, but those are the main 3 things. So I've got a little picture of the oil well there, That's the fossil fuel. It's sunset, so I'm also acknowledging the sun, and that is also important. But there is no doubt that carbon dioxide affects climate. And this is really fundamental science. I'm not just a geologist, I'm a chemist. All of chemistry is based upon some of our understanding that underpins how we know the greenhouse effect works. We understood this 200 years ago. In this paper, 120 years old, Svante Arrhenius speculated that burning fossil fuels would cause the planet to warm. I'm not saying that because we've known it for a while, but I'm saying to underscore just how fundamental the science is. It is not exaggerating to say the science is almost as fundamental as our understanding of gravity. The other thing we know is what we've measured. Carbon dioxide increasing. 400 parts per million in the atmosphere. Throughout most of the past several million years, it's been between about 170 and 280. It's a 50% increase since the Industrial Revolution. In my work, it seems fairly likely that the Earth has not experienced this much carbon dioxide for 3 million years. That's a big change. And we know it has caused warming. This is a graph of the sort of anomaly. Many of you will have seen it. This year is a bit of a milestone. It's been exaggerated by natural variability, but we have experienced what most people argue is a 1 degree warmer world because of CO2. And of course, what we agreed in Paris is we were going to try to keep it to 1.5 degrees. We're already 1 degree in. Okay, so these are the things that we know, and if you want me to elaborate or have questions, we can ask at the workshop, or you can ask me afterwards. But what are some of the things that we're worried about but come with more uncertainty? Because there are debates. A little statistical mess over there on the right side of the slide. But what that shows us is We know that carbon dioxide causes warming. There is legitimate debate over how much warming. A lot of people, a lot of climate skeptics try to make a lot of this. Let me put this in very simple terms. If climate is more sensitive to carbon dioxide, then we are way behind the curve and we need to start acting very, very fast, and we have a lot of ground to make up. If climate is on the low sensitive side, as some climate skeptics have argued, people who are doing legitimate science, I should say, people who are legitimately concerned and trying to tackle this, but they argue that the climate is not as sensitive and warming will not be as pronounced, then in that case, we just have to start tomorrow. Right? It's still urgent, it's just that we have a little bit more time. And by a little bit more time, I mean 24 hours or so. We really need to get going on this. If climate is less sensitive, we have a little bit more wiggle room, but we don't have much. And 2046 and 2050, these are our targets, no matter what the climate sensitivity is. Other questions on how fast? We are adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere faster than any time that we know of in the past 66 million years, probably faster than almost any time in Earth history. We don't know what will happen. We know that ice will melt, but how fast? We know ecosystems will have trouble responding, but they've never had to respond to a change this fast before. Big uncertainty, big uncharted territory. This is what we really talk about. What will be the impacts? Sea level is going to rise. The oceans will warm, ice will melt. How much? We all care. The Maldives cares, but we all care. There's a legitimate debate about how much it will rise, but it will rise. And more if we raise temperatures. What about flooding? There's a lot of uncertainty about things like hurricanes. We're not really quite sure how climate change will affect hurricanes. We're learning, but that's tricky. But what we do know is warmer air holds more water. When it rains, more water comes down. In the future, rain events will have more rain and we will have more floods. That's just physics. Unfortunately, ecosystems come with great uncertainty, and unfortunately this year we are learning that we are really already beginning to stress them dramatically. We are seeing one of the worst coral reef death events in our lifetimes. And coral reefs will recover over 10 to 15 years. But if events like this year happen every 4 or 5 years, our children will live on a world without coral reefs. They will not have enough time to recover. And again, our colleagues from the Maldives are seeing this happen. And they are seeing how it is affecting their fishermen and their food and livelihoods. And oops, and that sort of brings me to the last point. I actually grew up on a dairy farm, so this is the one that always concerns me the most. Given everything else, temperature, rainfall, ecosystems, great uncertainty about whether or not we'll be able to produce the amount of food that we need. These are really fundamental things, and they lead then to the really great uncertainty, which is the societal impacts. How do all of these things affect people? Will it be fair? Will it be just? How will it affect things like the NHS? How will it affect conflict? We don't know. What I would argue is that there is no uncertainty that these are risks. I'm not up here predicting a certain amount of sea level rise or predicting our food security will collapse. What I am saying is there is no doubt that there is a risk. And scientists do not disagree about that. I'm going to allow myself one opinion right here. My opinion, no sane society willingly exposes itself to that degree of risk. To the risk of hundreds of millions being displaced by rising sea level or drought or famine. To our food supplies being put at risk. That is why we really, really, really must act, even though we don't know for certain what will happen. The real question, why we're all here tonight, is how should we act? I think I'd like to leave with just one sort of positive thought. Climate change will affect all of these other types of issues, as I alluded to in the beginning. That means that addressing climate change is actually an opportunity to address so many other issues in our society. It shouldn't just be the elephant in the room. It should be a way to sort of catalyze a more creative way of tackling a lot of our other issues in a collective, holistic way. If we do climate change right, we can make our NHS more robust, we can make our economy more robust, we can really view this as a grand challenge that inspires us, rather than some terrible, terrible catastrophe that we must avert. And that's where I'm really excited about how Frome is tapped into this, because I get the sense you're tapped into with a real spirit of optimism. So that's all. Thank you very much. Real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
If there were points that Rich made that you want to sort of clarify, and say we'll get time for more discussion later, but if there were bits within that anyone wanted to ask where, what was that figure about, or what's that graph, then go for it. No? Fine, thanks.
All good?
You can have that opportunity. Totally clear, thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's very nice to be here. I always feel slightly intimidated when I come to Frome, in a good way, because I'm aware that I'm in the company of experts. I feel exceptionally intimidated tonight, having just heard what Richard said, Mohammed said, so I'm very nervous to be standing in front of you, but equally it's a pleasure to be here. So I've been doing a bit of work for Frome, looking at where the town might go in the future in terms of carbon emissions and how we might define that. I say we, I use that term sort of loosely, but I hope you understand what I mean by that. And I just want to share a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing and some of the thinking about where that might go next. Quite a lot of that is up for discussion, really, and it really comes down to what collectively the town wants to do. So there's no prescribed route to this, but I just want to give you a flavour of the sort of things that have come out of that and what that might mean. I've spent 23 years now, nearly 24 years, addressing climate change or tackling climate change, and I'm finding that increasingly frustrating. And my sense is that human beings only really solve problems when they commit to actually solving them as opposed to addressing them. And in a sense, part of what I'm thinking about and been able to think about through this bit of work is how do we move from just addressing this, which can mean all sorts of things, to actually committing to solving that. And in a way, that's what's so encouraging about what the Maldives was doing. They worked out what they needed to do to solve the problem, and they came up with a plan to do that. And so that's part of the background to this work, certainly from my point of view. What I think was significant about Paris was A, lots of people, myself included, were pleasantly surprised that there was an agreement, so that was fantastic. Secondly, that agreement referenced 2 degrees, and more importantly, that it referenced 1.5 degrees. So that was, for me, a real game changer, a really significant moment. But the other thing is absolutely, it means the end of using fossil fuels, burning fossil fuels, to generate power and heat. There really is no doubt about that. We have to think about the end of fossil fuels. You'll hear a lot from politicians about very long sort of tail off, the fact that we might be using them well into next century. That is not what the Paris Agreement says. We need to be thinking about ending the use of fossil fuels to generate heat and power. So the question then is, what does it mean for Frome? But actually that's a question that applies to every village, every town, every city, in the whole of the developed world and in the rest of the world as well, because we need to be asking, how do we make that transition? How do we make that move? How do we get off fossil fuels? And in the course of the work we did, we thought about a number of different ways, talking with colleagues here in the council, talking about a number of different ways about how you might express that and what that might mean. And so the starting point for discussion is that Frome becomes fossil-free by 2046, which is what Peter was saying. So within 30 years, it is not using any fossil fuels to generate heat and power. Now you might look at that and go, well, that's crazy because it's far too ambitious. Or you might look at it and go, it's crazy because it's not ambitious enough. And in a sense, that's what this is about. It's a starting point for discussion. And I would welcome anyone who thinks, well, we can go much faster than that. Fantastic, let's work out how to do it. If you think it's way too ambitious, let's work out what the barriers are and how we might address those. So where are we today? So I can give you numbers on where we are in terms of what Frome uses today in terms of its power, electricity and its gas. And they don't mean anything to me. They're big numbers. They don't mean a great deal to me. It's much easier, I think, to think about what do we use individually, what do people in Frome use individually every day on average. For me, that's a much more manageable number. So if you think about electricity or power, on average, everybody's different, so don't panic if your figure's much lower than this. On average, it's about 6 kilowatt hours of electricity per person per day. Now, just to remind us, it's getting harder to say this because they're now an old piece of technology, but when I was growing up, a 1 bar electric fire was still quite a common thing. and a 1 bar electric fire is a 1 kilowatt appliance, so that running for 1 hour uses 1 kilowatt hour. So one way of thinking about 6 kilowatt hours is that you've got 6 1 bar electric fires running for 1 hour. But that's roughly what we use, and actually that 6 kilowatt hours is about equivalent to running a 250 watt appliance. You think something like a food blender or something like that, 24 hours a day. So if you had your finger on the button of that, 24 hours a day, you would consume 6 kilowatt hours of electricity. In terms of gas, it's more because we use that energy for heating, so it's about 13 kilowatt hours per day, and that's pretty average actually, if I compared that with some other places, and that's pretty average. So that's what we've got to meet without using fossil fuels. That's what we've got to meet using renewable energy. Now, if we just took those bald figures and said, okay, let's just do a bit of kind of thought experimentation, see how we might get, how could we do it if we were just sticking wind turbines around the place? I should add, I'm not proposing this, but it's just good to kind of do the thinking on this. So it's about 7 to 10 turbines that you might need to meet that sort of equivalent amount of power. Equally, if you were looking at field scale PV, it's about 158 small football pitches. So I looked it up, I'm not a footballer. The smallest football pitch is 90 by 120 metres if you talk to FIFA. It's about 158 of those in terms of area that you might need. And if we said, well, let's just see if we can meet 12% of the requirement for heat by wood from sustainable sources, you need about 23 square kilometres. It's less if you use different types of wood like willow coppice. If you're just using wood from sustainable sources, it's about that sort of level. Now I look at those figures and I think, well, that's quite hefty, that's quite a lot to find. And one of the key things to remember, one of the amazing things about fossil fuels is they have such high energy density. So the energy density of oil on an equivalent basis is more than TNT. They're fantastically energy dense. And that means we've got away with being able to do things, A, in a very inefficient way, and B, it's very easy, once you get that energy in a concentrated form, to be able to use it. Renewables come in a completely different way. They're much less dense, they require much bigger areas, and that's why we have to think quite differently about how we might generate the equivalent amount of energy. But we can do better than this, we can do much better than this. I just want to introduce you to some of the thoughts that how we might do that. And I'm going to give you 4 big wins, which I hope will kind of lead on to the discussion tonight. And it's important to say that you could meet that need for heat and power in any number of ways. You could say we want to go down the wind route, we want to go down the solar route, we really want to focus on biomass. There's a whole combination of things that you could do, and I don't want to be prescriptive, and in a sense that's the exciting thing about this. That's the thing that we've kind of got to get our heads around. So the first one, and I make no apologies for this, is the one that many of us have been banging on about for about a decade, 10 decades, 5 decades, whatever. Energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is absolutely critical. Okay, we can make huge impact. Now there was a study done by the MEP for this area, Molly Scott Cato. She commissioned a piece of work, and that piece of work reckoned that in Somerset you could reduce the demand for energy by about 40% over the next 30 years by really focusing on energy efficiency measures. That's things like the measures to make your homes more efficient appliances, and also behavioural measures as well. And one of the things I want to just emphasise is that I could sit at home on a winter's evening, I could feel a bit cold, and I could crank up my thermostat, and in the course of a day I can add another 30 kilowatt hours to the amount of energy that I use in my home. If we all did that, that's a lot of energy. If we have to meet that renewably, we need to think what that means. That means we have to build infrastructure, we have to build things out of steel, we have to go through planning, we have to find an area to put it in. We have to go through all of that kind of process just to accommodate the fact that we turned up our thermostat. So that behavioural element, that thing that we can do to save energy, is absolutely fundamental to this. And I know it's not the sexiest thing, and I know we get a bit bored of talking about it, but it is absolutely fundamental, and it underpins everything that I'm going to say. So you can make some really big indents on this, roughly half the amount of power, and about the same in terms of, obviously it's a 40% reduction in terms of heat, so that's very significant. Second big one is rooftop PV. So this is PV that we could install on our homes. Now I've made some very broad assumptions about what sort of area you might have in Frome. I think they're reasonable, I've compared them with some other studies. And actually you can get a long way in terms of the average amount of energy that you might generate. So if you remember, it was about 6 kilowatt hours per day per person in terms of power, And in average terms, you could generate about 5. So you think, well, that's fantastic, we're almost there. But of course, that's an average figure. Most of that energy comes in the summer, and of course, we don't generate energy at night. So actually, if we're going to make real use of that, we can't get all of that, but if we're going to make a real contribution from that, we have to think about storage. We have to think about ways of doing that, and some really exciting new bits of technology which are coming along, which are going to make it easier to do that. Tesla is one of the high-profile companies doing that, but there's lots of other people who are working on that. And I think over the next 5 years, we're going to see some real innovation on that. So that's another thing that we could do collectively. PV plus storage, I think, is going to make a big impact. Heat pumps. In terms of the way we deliver our heat, we might feel that we're doing quite well. Some of us will, I'm sure, have boilers, gas boilers, which might be 95% efficient, 90% efficient, that sort of level. We can actually do much better than that if we think about technology like heat pumps, which can be 3 or 4 times more efficient than that. And actually, if we can get the energy efficiency measures into our homes, then we can get to the level where we can start to use these different types of technology. So that's another one where we can really start to drill down, bear down on the amount of energy that we need, and think about how we're going to meet that renewably. The fourth one I just want to bring up is around transport. There's quite a bit in the report I'm about to give to colleagues in the council around the energy required to move people and things around. It's actually staggering how much energy we need to do that. And part of the reason for that is that vehicles, petrol, diesel vehicles, are incredibly inefficient. Only a small proportion of the energy that we put into the tank is actually used to move people around, move things around. And so actually you can start to make some really big dents on that. If you get in your car for a short journey, you're using about 80 times more energy to move yourself around than if you got on a bike. If you have an electric bike, it uses a little bit more than the bike, but it's still a massive reduction from the amount of energy that you need if you're using a car. So that's an immediate big saving that we can make on that. Similarly with public transport, if we can get people out of cars and into public transport, again, that makes a huge difference in terms of the energy requirement that's needed. And then the other big change is going to be around shifting how we move in terms of our vehicles from diesel and petrol to electric cars. And that's already about 5 times more efficient. We might start to see that figure go up, but we also get big reduction in the carbon emissions around that as well. So that's something which we can really start to focus on. And of course, the other big thing about moving to electric vehicles is that we get some benefits in terms of air quality, local air quality. And I spent the afternoon in Yates, and I had to walk about 2 miles along the main road that runs through Yate, and it's really quite unpleasant on a day like today, and that's just with normal traffic. So actually, some of these issues may be long-term issues, but we've got some real immediate local benefits that we can get from that. So that's 4 things, that you might want to consider in discussions. There'll be more in the report that I'm about to hand over, but I just wanted to give a flavour. Some of this stuff can feel a bit daunting, but actually there's stuff where we can really start to bear down on this quite quickly and start to make some big inroads. So for me, the question is, how do we move from addressing to really getting to grips with this and solving it? How do we go from using fossil fuels to being fossil-free? And as I say, that can feel quite a challenge, but there's some real steps that we can make. And actually, if anywhere's going to lead on this, it's going to be Frome. So thank you very much.
So again, if there are queries about I don't know, the figures or the facts within that, or things you particularly want to pick up before we go into discussion now. Happy? Oh, go for it.
In respect of ending fossil fuels, then you touched on addressing transport. You would need about another 6 kilowatt hours a day for electricity to do the average 28 miles journey a day per car. So if you're designing renewable electricity, you need to factor in the extra generation that's needed for electric vehicles instead of fossil fuel.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And so the bit, just for reasons of time I haven't talked about, is in a sense we've got a stack of stuff that we're using now. We're trying to reduce that through efficiency, and then we're trying to meet that through renewables. Some of the stuff we're moving from heat to power, and therefore we've got to add to that power stack, and we've then got to think how we're going to meet that extra bit as well. So you're right. So for example, on heat pumps, we stop using gas, we start using heat pumps, which are a much more efficient way of delivering heat, but of course we've got to drive those, so we've got to think how we're going to meet the electricity from that as well. So there's no free ride on this, and I wouldn't want to imply there is any kind of sleight of hand on this. We've got to think how we're going to address all of this in very stark terms, because that's what we have to do. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
You said electric cars are emission-free, only at point of use.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
it's a bit of a cheat, isn't it?
Well, it would be a cheat if it, I mean, I didn't want to give that impression, you're absolutely right, but there's no tailpipe emissions, and the point I was making about walking down this road this afternoon was that what I was breathing in was the tailpipe emissions, the exhaust emissions. And you're right, we have to find the electricity, which the gentleman just there was saying, but nonetheless they are a much more efficient way of moving people per 100 kilometres, which is the way it's normally defined, passenger 100 kilometres. It's a much more efficient way. So we immediately get a lift in terms of that, but we still have to think how we're going to find the energy to do that. It's still better if we didn't drive a car at all, or we used buses, or we walked, or we took bicycle. But clearly, it's probably unreasonable to say to some people, well, you're going to have 20 miles to work, we expect you to cycle. So we've got to start thinking about how this integrates together. Yeah.
Okay, hang on a sec. I don't want to get too much into major discussion. So if these are things that are particularly around Mark's report, then actually, would you mind saying who you are?
Yeah,
okay.
I'm
Just because that'll help network us into who we are.
Yeah.
And obviously, one of the things you pick up immediately is there's a lot of expertise in the room, which is why I'm going to push you quite quickly, because I want us to get onto that. But go for it with these quick questions, and then we'll move on.
Just to come back on the electric car issue, as an electric car driver, on current energy, it's about a 20% saving on CO2, 100% saving on things like nitrous oxides and PM 2.5, but something that is hugely overlooked with the electric car is noise pollution.
Yes.
You're removing it.
Yes.
The average adult now, compared with 100 years ago, has a 6 dB hearing loss because of noise exposure.
Sorry? Sorry, and who are you?
I'm Nigel Dennis, and I'm from Climate Friendly Bradford-on-Avon.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Nick Cotterill, you showed us the diagram of a heat pump, and I'm not familiar with that. Could you just give a 30-second explanation as to how a heat pump enables you to heat your home?
No, in 30 seconds I couldn't, but I can just tell you, I can tell you it's similar in its use of physics and its technology to a fridge. So it uses an evaporative cycle to move heat from one place to another, and that's probably where I'm going to leave it. I'm very happy to give you a slightly more detailed explanation afterwards, and maybe in the report we could put a kind of more detailed one as well. But it's now quite a well-established technology, not only because we've all got, most of us have got fridges and freezers, but actually just as a technology itself in terms of delivering heat. But yeah.
So Sheila can tell you, she runs a shop which has a lot of fridges, and so she's been heat pumping her shop for the last few days, which, you know, is, so I agree, it's a fridge in reverse, in fact. Yeah. So, happy to move on to Anna? Good. Go for it. So Anna's got all the good news.
Thanks very much. So as Peter mentioned, I'm the Resilience Officer at Frome Town Council, and my role is primarily around looking at ways that we can reduce carbon emissions from both energy and transport, and also to improve resource efficiency. And also just to make Frome fossil free in the next 30 years, so small task, lot to do. But just to give you a little flavour, and sorry, some of you will be very familiar with a lot of these things, but over the last couple of years since I've been at the council, we've done a lot of sort of engagement work. So we've done things like Frome Open Homes, where we've had about 600 people visit local homes, some of whom are here, and be inspired to make changes in their own homes. We've had about 98% of people were inspired to then make carbon changes in their own homes. So just learning from neighbours and peers is a really effective way, and obviously they can also see house types that are similar to theirs. And in Frome, we've got huge challenges with our housing stock, because we've got solid walls, we've got lots of issues around damp and ventilation as well. In March, as many of you know and came to, we had a big event, Cheese and Grain, tied in with our twinning partnership. About 450 people attended that, looking at ways that we can link with our European partners to share sort of best practice and projects that are happening in France, Germany, England and Poland, and that was really inspiring. And from that we've been continuing the dialogue and sort of comparing effective ways really to engage with communities and to get funding and to actually get some of this, get homes insulated and that kind of thing. So that was great. So it was a shame that we then subsequently left Europe and scrapped deck and things like that. I've glossed over that bit. We've also got a team of fuel poverty volunteers that have been trained, such as Nick Dunk, who's a local energy champion. And so over the last couple of years we've been doing free energy advice sessions monthly over winter at the medical practice, and we have a team of people that can go to people's homes as well. So if we get alerted that somebody needs particular assistance with their heating controls or are having issues, we can go into their homes, and that's something that we would really like to develop further. We have a couple of people as well that have a lot of experience working in schools and engaging students and teachers around energy, and we've been working at Frome College. We'd love to do more here. We've also been working at Selwood and St John's Primary. We've done energy audits of all of those schools. We've engaged with the staff and the students, looking at ways that we can reduce their emissions and their costs. I mean, the savings, potential savings, are huge, so it's a win-win situation. And we would love to expand that programme further too. And then we've also got the energy volunteers also we borrowed a thermal imaging camera and sort of went that to local communities and did some basic thermal imaging, and we now have a thermal imaging camera that anyone can borrow from the share shop, again just to pinpoint heat loss. And then I had to mention one of the main vehicles that we thought initially that would enable us to reduce our emissions was the local energy co-op that we set up a couple of years ago.